So at this point, let's back up to this typography and animation comp and get from this point to the final camera pass. So I'll just start by organizing my After Effects project just for this class to make it a little bit easier. So we'll call this original and put all of these comps into that folder. And then I'm going to duplicate the typography and animation comp and move it out of that folder. And we're going to rename this Camera Pass 01. And I'll double click on that right away so I know that's the right comp and close all other timeline panels. That way I'm just left with this single comp and I can work from here. So we're back to layers that are not 3D. The only ones that have 3D switches on are text layers that have per character 3D enabled in their animation options. Again, this is something you can learn all about in my Ultimate Guide to Text Animators class, so check that out if you're interested. But that's why that little unique 2 cube 3D switch is on that layer. It's letting me know that per character 3D is enabled for that layer. But I need to turn 3D on for all of this text because it's all going to be animated in 3D. So I'm just going to click on this first layer and drag all the way down the list until all of my text layers are now 3D. Now there are some layers that are disabled here that I kept just for this one word lazy. I had to do a little bit of path animation, so I converted the text to shape layers, but I don't need these layers anymore at this point because I have my backup comps. So I'm just going to clear those out and just make sure that the only things that are in this comp are things I actually need. But now everything is in 3D, so I have my 3D switch, I can move it in and out, and at this point I need to decide what kind of camera I want to create. Let me turn off my guides real quick before we do that. Come up to View and Show Guides to hide that. And then let's think about our camera. Now obviously 50mm is going to mimic our eyes. It's going to keep the same perspective that we see right here. But because there are no other elements in our scene like the grid that I had in the example with the sunsets, even if I chose a different camera perspective, it wouldn't change the way this looks at all. So why don't we start by making a camera and seeing how the different perspectives affect things when we can't see anything else for reference. So I'm going to make a new camera, and I'm going to keep it a 2-node camera, and we'll use the preset of maybe 50mm just as a starting point. So this is our standard, basically no distortion camera view. If I press C to get to my camera tool, I can click and drag and it's going to orbit around that text. So there's no real perspective shift when I move the camera around at a 50mm camera lens. And because my point of interest is right in the center of my scene and that's where all of these text layers were created, the camera orbits right around that text. But what if we change this camera settings? Let's go back into the camera settings and then change it to, say, a 135mm lens. Well, then it's going to be super far zoomed in. I'll click OK, and then open up the transform properties and back the position up quite a bit. I'll hold down Shift until it's about where it was. I'll turn my guides back on. Command semicolon is the shortcut for that, just to kind of get that line back up with that rule of thirds, something like that, and then disable that again, Command semicolon. And then I can orbit around this text again. Now it might not be all that apparent what changed, but there's even less of a perspective shift when I rotate this camera around, because having such a zoomed in lens is really compressing all of the perspective in my scene. Even though there are no other elements in the scene, it is a different look. So let me undo that until we get back to our 50mm lens, and then let's change that camera settings again, and this time we'll go down to, say, 20mm, which is a very zoomed out lens, very wide angle. Click OK and then push the camera really far in until we get about where we were before. Now watch what happens when I orbit the camera. That text gets a lot more distortion around that perspective. And if I move it down to the side a little bit, it even looks kind of a lot bigger. And that makes a big difference on how you're perceiving this text. If I really fill up the frame and move the camera around like this, that text looks like it has a lot of heft. If you think of the 20th Century Fox logo animation, it kind of has this angle where the text is extruded and setting in the Hollywood Hills with those searchlights. This is kind of the camera movement you see. The camera is low, wide angle, and just rotating around to give you a sense of scale. Even though I don't have any other elements in my scene, this is actually affecting how you're perceiving how big this text is. And we could push this even further. Let me go back into the camera settings and change this to a 15mm lens, and then push in even closer, so the camera, if I switch to my two views, you can see that my camera is really close to the text. But if I move this around now, we're going to get a whole lot of distortion around the edges of the frame. That text is going to have a lot more of a perspective shift than a zoomed in lens. So this is a consideration you need to make at this stage. How do you want your text to look? Do you want it to feel like you're really up close to super large text? Do you want it to feel pretty normal, like it's just normal sized text without much distortion at all? Or do you want to feel like you're really far away from it, or it might be a lot smaller without much perspective change at all? I think for this camera pass, I'm going to take a little bit different direction than I did with the final render we just saw, and have more of this lens distortion and kind of have this close-up view. I like the way that looks. Another thing I want to point out real quick is that you don't have to stick to these preset size. Remember, the camera zoom right here, changing that camera settings preset is just changing the zoom value. So if I want an even wider lens than 15 millimeters, I can do that just by zooming the camera out a little bit further and then moving the camera in. And now look at how much lens distortion I have. It's totally wide and distorted and just looks really crazy. But because we're doing this in After Effects, it's all just being calculated to render however we want it to look. You can really push this far and make it look however you want. Now, I think that's a little too extreme, so I'm going to back up a little bit until we're back to this point. And I'm just going to pull the camera out a little bit more so it lines up where I had it before. And now all of my text should relatively look the same because the camera is looking straight on at it, and the position of the camera to the text is keeping it in that thirds. This is actually a good line to kind of test this on because I want that text top and bottom to line up with the thirds. I know I had it set that way when I was laying all this out in 2D. I'm just going to round this off to -800 to kind of offset that zoom value. So the zoom is at 800 pixels and my camera is 800 pixels back from the center of my scene. Now that that's decided, I need to start thinking about how I want the camera to move as the text is animating on, as well as between phrases. This again really depends on the song that you choose, the project that you're working on, but for this particular example, I think I want to keep the constant camera movement throughout the entire animation. I never want the camera to really be sitting still. So I'm just going to go to the start of this text animation and set a keyframe on the position of the camera. So I'll just hold Option and press P or Alt P on a PC, and that sets a position keyframe on the camera. Now I do have the point of interest, but I don't think I want to use a 2-node camera on this animation. And really that's just a personal preference. This is a point that you should really start thinking about what kind of camera setup you want to use. If you want to use a 2-node camera so that you have that point of interest, that's totally fine. Maybe you want to use a 1-node camera, or in this case, I want to use a null object to control a 1-node camera. So I'm going to set that up really quickly. I'm going to go up to Layer, Camera Settings, and change this to a 1-node camera. Click OK, and then I'm going to add a new null object, make that 3D, and I'll rename this camera controller, and then parent my camera to it. And that way I can grab this null around and just animate with that instead of the camera itself. So I'm actually going to take that position keyframe off and instead set a position keyframe on my camera controller, Option or Alt P. Alright, now with that set, I'm just going to back it up to before that text animates, and then move forward to probably right about here, because this is the point that the camera is probably going to transfer from this phrase to the next phrase. So at this point, I just want to move the camera in a little bit and just see what that motion looks like. Okay, so that pushing is probably faster than I want it to be. It gets a little bit closer than it needs to, so I'm just going to back it out a little bit and play it again. Yeah, I think that speed is a little bit better. So on all of these phrases, I'm going to try my best to match that kind of a push-in speed to keep the movement very consistent throughout the entire song. You can call me stupid. But this time around, I'd like to make the animation a little bit more dynamic than just having all of this straight on text the entire time. Let's play around with that perspective and that wide angle lens that we have to give it a different feel. So I'll back up here a little bit and switch to my rotation tool by pressing W on the keyboard, and then click and drag in this null to adjust the orientation of that null. So I'm going to push it down and to the left a little bit maybe. And I don't have to be very extreme with this, but just enough to give it a little bit more sense of this 3D space. And then I'll press Shift R to bring up the rotation for that layer and set a keyframe on the orientation value. Then I'll just back this up and hold Shift so that it snaps to this other keyframe on the position. And then I'll move forward to that second keyframe, again holding shift to snap to it, and rotate the camera around just a little bit. And then let's see what that looks like.
You can call me stupid.
Okay, so that rotation's probably a little bit too extreme, and I think I want to move closer to the text on both of these position values. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit on both of those and play it back.
You can call me stupid.
Okay, I'm still not really happy with this camera movement, but I want to just pause and say that this is literally my process. This is how I go through figuring out how I want my camera to move. I just try something, play it back, and see if I actually like it. And then I just modify things, adjust things until I'm happy. So I'm just going to keep on moving with this, and eventually I'm going to speed up this process so you don't have to see me making all of these decisions in real time. But at least with this example, for the first couple of phrases, I'm going to walk you through the entire thing. So I'm just going to back this up to maybe here, and then move my keyframes just so I have a better point of reference of what I'm actually doing when I'm modifying these keyframes. So I'm going to move this up and to the left a little bit more, and maybe zoom in on this text so that it's kind of starting where the text starts and then pulling out and rotating around as that second line comes in. Okay, so I'll back up to before the text animates on, right about there, move these keyframes back and play again. And that's better, but I'm still not quite there. I want to keep this text nice and large in the frame. It is really easy to make your text too big, or any element in the frame too big. Don't push your text so close to the edges here. Just a basic design principle. You want to make sure that you're giving some room to breathe. But I kind of want to make sure that the emphasis goes from the top left to the bottom right. So I'm going to just kind of push and pull this around until I'm happy with the way it looks.
You can call me stupid.
Okay, that's really getting there, but I think I want to push this wide angle lens even further, because honestly there's not as much lens distortion as I was expecting. So let me go back into my camera settings, into the camera options, and zoom out even further. So we'll go to maybe 450 and then push the camera in. Now I'm going to try and do this at the same time for both keyframes by selecting the property, making sure both keyframes are selected, and also making sure that my timeline scrubber is on top of one of those keyframes. And then I'll just click and drag the Z property, and this is going to modify both keyframes proportionally. So I want to move this up a little bit, and then we'll see where this first set of keyframes was. Yeah, that's not bad, but now we have more of that camera distortion. I just want to end up a little bit closer to the text. So this is really extreme, but it's just going to be a different feel than the other example, the final render that you've already seen. So I'm going to try and just push it a little bit further than I normally would, just to see what we end up with. So let's play this one more time.
You can call me stupid.
Okay, I think that's actually pretty good. And remember, I'm not worried that much about the actual camera movement. I'm just concerned with where the camera starts and ends for this phrase. I can worry about the easing between these keyframes in the next camera pass. For now, I just want to get everything blocked out. But let's call that first phrase done. On my keyboard, I have a number pad on the right side, and there is a period on that number pad. If I press that, it'll preview just the audio. If you don't have that number pad with that decimal point, then just hold down Control and press the actual period key on the main part of your keyboard to preview the audio only. But I want to do that at this point just so I can see how much time I have between the end of this camera move and the start of the next phrase. So I need to get the camera to the next phrase within that time, and I want to make sure that that's not too rushed. So the text is actually animated on at this point, and I kind of have just a camera move. So I have some time to play with how quick or slow I want this camera transition to be between phrases. We'll just keep these keyframes where they are for now and go to where the next block of text starts. Now, this is in the exact same position in this After Effects comp world as this text, so the camera really doesn't need to go anywhere to see it next. Obviously, that's not what I want. I want the text to be in a different location so I can move my camera from point A to point B. This is where I want to bring up my second comp viewer so that I can see this scene from a different perspective. So I think from the top down it's going to work just fine. This way we can see how the camera is moving around the text right here. There's my camera controller, here's my text. and I can decide where I want the next block of text to be. So I'm going to zoom out nice and far here and then grab these text layers, which this layer right here has position animation on it already, so I'm going to parent that line to this line right here. That way I can move it around and still preserve that position animation. But let's say I want it to go maybe back into the right a little bit. Since the camera was moving from the top left to the bottom right of the first phrase, we'll have the camera kind of pan over and go through space and turn to the right a little bit more. So I'm going to grab that text layer, move it over and move it back in Z space, and maybe somewhere around there is a good spot. So that's where I need to get my camera to using this camera controller. So I'm just going to move this over, move this back, and kind of grab it on the Z axis here and push it in. And maybe we'll kind of have that same left to right camera movement, so I need to rotate it. I'll press W to get to my rotation tool and just readjust that camera rotation to something like this. Now obviously it took the camera too far to get to that point, but I needed that text for reference. Now I can back my scrubber up in time to where that text starts to animate, and that's about when I want the camera to be to that next block of text. So it doesn't have to be before that text starts animating, because the camera could be moving as those lyrics are coming on, but we'll play with it until we're happy with the way that it looks. So now that I have the camera about where I want it to be, I'm going to switch back to my one view. And we can look at what's happening. So it moves from this point past the text and then to this point as the text is animating on. I think I could even push that out a little bit further to make that transition last a little longer. And then it's going to do a very similar type of camera move where it's just rotating around, moving, and maybe pushing in a little bit to get a little bit different of a perspective change to this point. Okay? So those are my basic keyframes, and now I'll just work on the timing a little bit. I have all the way to this point before the next block of text animates on, so maybe I'll push these keyframes out to right around here, and we can play this back.
You can call me stupid. You can call me cheap.
Cool, I think that's good. For this next transition, I think I want to move actually through the text. I want to fly between these lines. So let's get this next block of text behind all of this text in 3D space. So again, I'll switch to my horizontal view, move my timeline scrubber over this point so I can see all this text and grab it all. I'll press P to bring up the position properties, and sure enough, yes, I did animate the position of these 4 layers, so I need to make sure that they are parented to this layer. That way that position animation is preserved and I can just move the one text layer instead of all of them. And I'll just position this further back in space. Remember, the camera hasn't moved yet, so I need this to be further away for the camera to fly to. So I'm going to just push it back about there, and then we can animate the camera again. So it's going from this point here and needs to get to that text back there. So I'll switch back to my one view, grab my camera controller, and zoom in to that point. And maybe on this one, I'll keep the rotation fairly straight on to start, and then I'll kind of rotate it down so this text all looks nice and big and tall. Okay, so I'm going to move this forward in time again, push in. Actually, I'm going to push both of these in quite a bit. I need to back this up and get even closer on this text so the camera's not moving too fast. And then rotate this down a little bit and position this more like it's looking up at this really big text. So I'm just playing around with this. You can use guides that you've set out yourself, or just press the apostrophe key on the keyboard to bring up the title safe and action safe guides, your comp guides. And that kind of helps me keep things nice and centered and lined up. So this is what this camera move looks like. It zooms through that text. I made sure that it goes straight between these 2 layers so it doesn't intersect anything, and then as it gets to this text, it's going to just keep pushing in slightly and rotating down, looking up at all of that text. Okay, so that's really my process. I'm going to time-lapse through a lot of the rest of this process, but I'm making these decisions kind of on the fly. How do I want the camera to move next between these blocks of text? What direction should it be moving? Do I want to rotate the camera at all? Until I've gotten through all of it. And one thing I should point out, that if I go back to my 2 views, I am getting, outside of the comp with my camera because I'm moving it around so much. So just remember that you can zoom out using the Track Z camera tool, and you can pan around in this view just by using the Track XY. So always remember those little tools, those camera tools that you can use in any of the perspective views or the custom views to be able to navigate around your world and reposition elements however you need to. Now at this point of the song right here, let's just listen to it. That point right there where there's kind of like a guitar slide. I want to have a camera movement where the camera's kind of falling back and rotating up, so pointing towards the sky basically for this next transition. Now to get this to line up nicely, I want to use my Command or Control key while scrubbing through to preview the audio as I'm scrubbing. So right there. That frame is where that hit is with the drums and where the guitar slide starts. So that's where I want the last keyframes of this camera movement for the previous phrase to end, and the camera transition to the next phrase begins. But if I play this again, I want it to end right about there. So basically right when the text is coming in, that's where this camera move is going to end. And this is going to be a little bit more complex of a move, so I'm going to show you how I'm going to approach it. Obviously, I need to rotate the camera, but I want to do this in a way that I can see it from multiple angles. So let's switch to two views, and then instead of the top-down view, let's look at the left view, and I've got to figure out where my camera is. There it is. I'll zoom in nice and close. So this is the left side of this text. So my camera is here, the camera controller here, and the text. I want the camera to rotate back so that it's basically pointing up instead of straight on. And I also want the camera to move back in Z-space a little bit. So I'm going to move the camera back a little bit, and then I'm going to rotate the X-axis this direction and hold Shift so that it snaps to 90-degree increments. And now you can see, because we're rotating around the null object, the camera is actually past that text in Z-space, so it's behind it now. So I actually need to push this back even further, basically until we can't see it anymore. So I really want to move that back quite a bit. And then maybe move it up so it's more of a straight line from this point to this point. But that camera movement is now pulling back and looking up. But if we play this back, and I'm just going to mute the audio for a second so that's not distracting. You see that it's kind of got a weird movement to it. I mean, besides the fact that it's really jerky, let me just ease this with the F9 key so it's easier to look at. You can see that it pulls back, rotates a little bit, and then it rotates a little faster, and then it kind of looks like it's just sliding down. And this is because of the way that the camera is actually moving. Remember, we're animating the null, not the camera. So the motion isn't exactly what I want it to be. If you watch the camera itself, it's kind of traveling from here to here and just barely arching. It's really more of a linear movement than anything. And I want to shape that motion path so that it does arch and follows more of a circular movement, really arching more like this instead of going straight in a line. Well, if you've ever used motion paths in After Effects, you probably know that you can modify them. So if I select just my null and look at any of these points, they're all linear. And that's actually because I have a preference set up in After Effects that defaults all of this motion to being perfectly linear. If you come up to After Effects, go to Preferences, and then General, there's a checkbox right here that says Default Spatial Interpolation to Linear. This is by default unchecked, and I really want to encourage you to check it, because with it unchecked, After Effects is going to try to automatically smooth out all of your motion paths, and it's going to be bad. Just trust me, it's going to do a poor job of it, and you're going to wonder why your camera is drifting or why your animations of other objects are just moving in ways that you aren't expecting. Set that default to linear spatial interpolation so that you have control over how your motion paths move. Now in 3D we have the ability to work in not just 2 dimensions with motion paths, but obviously 3rd dimension, Z-space as well. And this can be pretty confusing if you're not looking at it from the right perspective. So let me just show you what I mean by this. I want to arc this motion path. So I'm going to switch to my pen tool to do this. and then click on this point right here, and that will add a Bezier handle which I can then shape my motion path with. So if I would just want to arc it upwards, that's fine. I'm looking at this from the left view, the left perspective view, so I know it's directly on that left axis, and I can know that I'm only modifying this motion path on the Y and Z axes. The X axis, which would be left and right, I don't have access to in this straight on left view. So let's just arch this up a little bit and see how that affected my camera move. Okay, it is very subtle, but there is a difference. I think I want to make this even more extreme, so I'm going to add a second handle. First I'll back this one up over here, and then add a second one right here on this point. And this is going to add a second handle that is modifying the path between the previous two keyframes. So I need to be very careful here. Again, the actual camera movement can be smoothed out in the next camera pass, but I'm just taking this opportunity to show you how all of these motion paths work. So I'll switch to my pen tool, click and drag to try and make this a little bit straighter between these 2 points, and I'm going to zoom in nice and close so I can see this clearly. But with that pen tool, because I started modifying the path, it broke the relationship between this handle, and that's exactly what I wanted. But now that that's straight between these two keyframes, I can focus on this arch right here and just make this a little bit more circular. So now let's take a look at how that looks. And even just scrubbing through, you can see that it's kind of constantly rotating at a steady rate now, rather than having this weird slight rotation, moving back, and then rotating more. So let's play this back. And I think that's looking a little bit better. Again, this is not the beauty pass for this camera pass. We're not easing these keyframes yet, so it doesn't look all that great. But the actual path that the camera is taking is now looking a little bit better to me. And I just noticed that it looks like my camera actually rotated too far back. It's at 91.9 degrees, and that's probably because when I was holding shift to snap it in increments of 90 degrees, I forgot that the camera wasn't rotated perfectly straight onto this text. So I just want to make sure that I change that to 90 degrees. And now we're at a good neutral place. But this is going to make things a little bit more complicated for the next block of text, because now that text is at a different angle than what my camera is pointed at. So from here on out, I need to make sure that I'm rotating all of these layers to the camera's perspective correctly. Okay, I'm going to get back at this and finish up the rest of my text. And now that I've added in another keyframe, I want to point out something, and that is that because I added in that Bezier handle on the previous keyframe, I now have Bezier handles on the next keyframe. So I want to actually just remove that for now and worry about that more in the next camera pass when I'm doing more of the polished look. But I just switched to my left view, broke the relationship between those two handles, straightened it out again right here, and then removed the handle on this keyframe. And I can even take off the easing by command clicking on it so that there's no influence on that keyframe at all. Alright, back to it. At this point I want to rotate it 180 degrees clockwise so the text is going around to the left. And in my left perspective view, obviously I can't see the motion that I want to arc here. So really I need to switch to the front view to be able to see this, and just reposition until I can find my paths, my motion paths, and go from here. Oh, actually no, that's not the perspective I want to look at, because remember my camera is rotated around in 3D space. So I need to kind of just move around this until I see this text the way that it should be seen. So the top view is actually backwards, which means that this perspective view is on the opposite side of the text that my camera is seeing from. So I actually need to go to the bottom view and then reposition my camera so that I'm looking at this from the other side. So this is where you really need to keep track of what orientation your camera is set to, and just figure out what view you need to look at in order to modify the motion path at any given point. So I want to arc this one out this direction. So if I grab that position keyframe so it's selected, I can even modify this in my camera, active camera view. Click once just to add that handle, and now I can see it clearly in my bottom view. I'll grab this handle way out here and just bring it down, since I didn't really want a handle there. and then just arc out this camera movement. So I'm going to handle this just like the other rotation where I kind of arc this out quite a bit to give it more of a circular movement between phrases. And I think I'm going to move this even further down and arc it out a little bit further. Another really quick way of getting text oriented and lined up with where your camera is by parenting it to your camera controller or camera while holding shift. So this text layer for the next phrase is parented to this text layer. If I grab that text layer and grab the parent pick whip while holding down shift and drag it to the camera controller, it's going to parent it to that camera controller but also adopt all of those transform properties. So it moved that layer to where the camera controller is, and it rotated and oriented it around so that it's now facing the camera. It's the same as that camera controller. That's a really quick way to reposition it, but as soon as that's done, I'm going to unparent it from the camera so that it's not affected by the camera's movement. Now on this push in, if I just move it straight forward on the z-axis, it's going to intersect that O. Obviously I don't want that, and it's going to be kind of tricky because I want to move it kind of over, right, maybe going straight through that O. But as soon as I do that, if I keep pushing back and then I step back a little bit, there's no guarantee that the camera's motion path is still going to align to the middle of that O. So really I want to grab that second keyframe of the motion path and adjust it with my playhead kind of where it's going to pass through the O. So at this frame with this spacing, that's kind of where it is. And if I go to my two views and look at this, from the view where I can basically see it top down on the text, which I honestly don't know what angle that would be for the orientation that I'm currently in, looks like it's actually the top view. So let me just reposition this a little bit so I can see it better, zoom in nice and close. And what I want to do is grab that second keyframe, this one right here of the motion path, and just modify it until it goes between the O segment, which I actually can't even tell where that is anymore. So I want to go right in here. So I need to back this up maybe right about there. And now it should fly directly through the center of that O. So that's how I would handle that type of situation. And for the end of this animation, I have this transition already designed where it kind of warps out. So I want to make sure that that is nice and straight on. So I'm going to make sure that orientation at the final keyframes is just straight on at a 90-degree angle to the text. And I wanted to fill up the frame nice and big like that. But with that, my camera moves are all blocked out. I just want to time this a little bit better, probably just going all the way to the end of that transition so that movement is constant. But now everything is set up. I have every one of my camera movements for every phrase blocked out. I have the transitions laid out so I know how the camera is going to be moving from phrase to phrase. And it's just a different take on the same song, the same lyrics as the render that I've already showed you. But I think this will just have a little bit different of a feel, and we can move on to the next pass.